Behind borders and polite slogans, real lives are being shredded by paperwork, policy, and peril. From families stranded in airport holding rooms to long-settled workers suddenly labelled illegal, the human cost hides in late-night raids, vanished biometrics, and decisions nobody can appeal in time. Children sleep in hotel corridors. Survivors of war face fresh trauma in detention. Lawyers scramble, phones die, deadlines pass, and a single typo can end a future. Tonight we open confidential letters, step inside silent corridors, and hear whispers headlines so often miss. 10 stories showing how a system can break people before it breaks rules. Number 1. The Windrush Scandal. In 2018, the United Kingdom faced one of its most shocking immigration nightmares, the Windrush Scandal. It began when hundreds of Caribbean-born residents who had lived and worked legally in Britain for decades were suddenly told they were illegal immigrants. Many lost their jobs, homes, and access to healthcare. Some were detained and even deported to countries they hadn't seen since childhood. They had arrived legally between 1948 and 1971 to rebuild post-war Britain. Yet decades later, their records were destroyed. Under a government policy aimed at creating a hostile environment for undocumented migrants. The horror deepened when stories surfaced of people like Paulette Wilson, a grandmother who worked in Parliament's cafeteria, detained despite living in the UK for over 50 years. Families were torn apart, pensions frozen, and lives derailed by bureaucratic cruelty. Official documents revealed that the Home Office ignored warnings about missing records. Public outrage grew as it became clear that innocent citizens had been victims of systemic negligence. The scandal exposed how rigid immigration rules could erase entire identities, leaving victims fighting for proof of a life they already lived. Years later, the scars remain. Though the government apologised and set up a compensation scheme, progress has been painfully slow. Out of thousands eligible, only a small fraction have been paid. Many victims died before receiving justice. What began as a paperwork failure became a symbol of institutional betrayal. A warning that immigration systems designed to protect borders can just as easily destroy lives within them. The Windrush Scandal reminds the world that legality without humanity creates horror, not from war or disaster, but from indifference buried beneath official stamps and cold letters. Number 2. Detention centres. The hidden prisons of modern Britain. Behind tall fences and motionless guards, the UK's immigration detention centres hold thousands of people who have committed no crime, only overstayed a visa or awaited a decision. Many are trapped for months or even years without trial, their freedom suspended in a legal void. Inside these facilities, like Yarl's Wood, Brook House, and Harmondsworth, residents speak of constant lights, endless waiting, and fear that tomorrow may bring deportation to a country they barely remember. Reports by watchdog groups describe suicide attempts, hunger strikes, and overcrowded rooms where hope drains faster than daylight. Among the most disturbing accounts is that of Abdul Rahman, an asylum seeker who fled war only to face psychological torment in a British cell. He described being handcuffed during hospital visits, sleeping near men who wept silently, and being told nothing about his case. In 2025, new footage leaked from a detention centre showed guards mocking detainees and using force during searches. The government promised reform, yet annual figures still show over 20,000 people detained under immigration powers each year. Human rights lawyers argue that indefinite detention violates dignity, but policy continues to prioritise control over compassion. For many, release comes without warning, sometimes after years, sometimes only to be re-arrested weeks later. No conviction, no trial, just uncertainty. These stories reveal how easily bureaucracy can resemble imprisonment when compassion is removed. The UK calls these centres administrative facilities, but for those inside, they are invisible prisons, hidden from the public eye, yet funded by taxpayers. Their stories echo through locked corridors and quiet deportation flights, reminding us that fear can be manufactured and liberty can vanish quietly, one rejected application at a time. Number 3. Hotel asylum housing. A life paused in limbo. Across Britain's cities, thousands of asylum seekers now live in hotels once meant for tourists. Over 32,000 people are housed in these rooms, waiting months or even years for their asylum claims to be processed. At first glance, a hotel may sound comfortable, but inside, life feels frozen. Families share single rooms, meals arrive cold in plastic trays, children grow up without space to play. Outside, communities protest, claiming resources are strained, while those inside are left isolated behind drawn curtains, unable to work, study, or rebuild their lives. For many, this is not refuge. It is limbo wrapped in thin white sheets. One Afghan interpreter who aided British troops described the crushing silence of waiting. Every knock on the door could mean transfer, rejection, or deportation. Mental health charities report alarming rates of depression and self-harm among residents. With no certainty of future, days blend into nights. Some are relocated from one hotel to another with only hours' notice, losing any sense of stability. The system meant to protect the vulnerable instead traps them between hope and despair, where life is reduced to a number on a case file. In 2025, reports surfaced of entire families spending over 500 days in these conditions. Local councils complained of lack of coordination. The Home Office blamed backlog and budget constraints. Yet for those living it, the real horror is emotional decay, the slow erosion of identity and purpose. Children ask when they'll go to school again, while parents stare at paperwork that never moves. Britain's hotels have become holding cells with Wi-Fi, symbols of a system unable to deliver on its promise of sanctuary. Behind every window light, there's a story paused by bureaucratic paralysis and endless waiting. Number 4. The Afghan interpreters. Scandal. Promises betrayed. Lives at risk. When British forces withdrew from Afghanistan, hundreds of Afghan interpreters who had risked their lives to support UK troops were promised safety. They believed evacuation meant freedom and gratitude. Instead, many found themselves trapped in bureaucracy, stranded abroad, or facing death threats while waiting for approval. In 2025, leaked documents revealed the government's relocation scheme had lost sensitive data, exposing names and addresses of interpreters still hiding from the Taliban. This digital blunder turned a promise of protection into a potential death sentence, as families were forced to move constantly to avoid capture. Some interpreters who reached Britain describe being placed in temporary accommodation for months with no updates, separated from families still in danger. One former translator, Samuullah, spent over 2 years sending unanswered emails to the Home Office, begging to bring his wife and child to safety. Others faced visa rejections despite clear evidence of their service to British forces. The media uncovered stories of interpreters who had translated in frontline battles, now sleeping in tents outside foreign embassies. Their loyalty was repaid not with respect, but with silence and red tape. The Financial Times reported that the relocation programme had ballooned in cost, over £7 billion, while processing times slowed dramatically. Lawmakers called it a moral failure, a stain on Britain's legacy of wartime alliances. These interpreters were once the voice between soldiers and survival. Yet now their own voices go unheard. For them, the horror lies not in war's chaos, but in the indifference of peace. A world where paperwork moves slower than danger, and promises of refuge dissolve under the weight of government neglect. Their courage deserved safety. Instead, it met bureaucracy's coldest face. Number 5. The one-in, one-out deal. Lives shuffled like paperwork. In 2025, the UK and France introduced a controversial migration pact known as the one-in, one-out deal. For every asylum seeker the UK accepted, another was sent back across the Channel to France. It was sold as a balanced solution to control illegal crossings, but for migrants caught between two nations, it became a nightmare of uncertainty. People who had already endured dangerous boat journeys found themselves ping-ponged between borders, detained, released, and detained again. For many, it wasn't a life. It was an endless loop, dictated by paperwork and politics. Among the stories that surfaced was that of Binyam, a Sudanese refugee who crossed the Channel after surviving torture in Libya. Just weeks after applying for asylum, he was told he would be sent back to France under the new deal. He was held in limbo, unable to appeal, and forced to move between temporary shelters while his case awaited transfer. Similar cases multiplied as legal aid groups warned that the agreement violated international asylum laws. Charities reported growing mental health crises in camps near Calais, where hundreds were left waiting for decisions that never arrived. By late 2025, over 10,000 people had been processed under this policy, but only a fraction were successfully relocated or integrated. Others vanished into the shadows, unregistered, undocumented, unseen. For these men, women and children, every ferry departure or flight represented not progress, but exile. The one-in, one-out scheme became a symbol of dehumanized diplomacy, where compassion was replaced by quotas. It showed how governments could turn human beings into statistics, lives measured not by need or justice, but by political balance sheets. Behind every exchange, a family's fate hung in silence, traded like numbers on a ledger. Number 6. The crackdown on illegal workers. Trapped between fear and survival. Across Britain, a wave of immigration raids has turned ordinary workplaces into zones of fear. In 2025, arrests of migrants accused of working illegally reached a record 8,200 cases, targeting restaurants, car washes, and delivery hubs. For many, these were not criminals. They were cooks, cleaners, and drivers supporting families, paying taxes, and filling essential jobs others refused. Yet new enforcement powers allowed officers to enter without warning, detain workers on the spot, and freeze wages pending investigation. Videos of handcuffed workers went viral, while employers distanced themselves overnight, leaving livelihoods shattered in minutes. One Bangladeshi chef named Rahim had lived in London for 9 years, raising 2 children and paying rent on time. When immigration officers raided his restaurant, he was detained despite having an ongoing visa appeal. His children waited at school, unaware their father was being questioned in a holding cell. Such stories multiplied as workers disappeared from communities without notice. Human rights groups called it a climate of fear, where even documented migrants stayed silent to avoid scrutiny. Many employers exploited that fear, underpaying staff, ignoring safety laws, and threatening to report anyone who spoke up. The government defended the crackdown as a deterrent, but critics said it punished the powerless while ignoring the systems that create illegal labour. Most detainees were deported within weeks, often without pay or proper legal counsel. Those who remained lived in hiding, fearing every knock at the door. Beneath the statistics lies the true horror. People treated as disposable parts of an economic machine, stripped of dignity for the sake of headlines. Britain's kitchens, warehouses, and construction sites became silent battlegrounds where survival collided with policy, and the human cost was quietly swept aside by enforcement efficiency. Number 7. The weaponization of words, turning migration into a threat. In the corridors of Parliament and across nightly news, the language of migration has shifted from discussion to defence. Researchers from leading universities revealed that UK political debates increasingly frame immigration as a security threat, not a social issue. This securitized narrative paints migrants as risks rather than contributors, fueling fear, division, and suspicion. Phrases like border control, invasion, and illegal entry dominate speeches and headlines, subtly shaping how the public perceives human movement. When words become weapons, empathy begins to fade, and policy follows rhetoric rather than reason. This transformation isn't abstract, it has real victims. Refugees waiting for status decisions report being treated as potential criminals. Ordinary residents of immigrant communities face rising hostility, job discrimination, and public harassment. One study from 2025 found a 40% increase in negative framing of migration within parliamentary debates compared to just 3 years earlier. Politicians use tough language to win votes, yet such talk legitimizes anger on the streets. What starts as campaign speech often ends with abuse in schools, vandalized homes, and growing mistrust between neighbours. The power of language silently builds walls long before any fence is erected. Experts warn that this shift changes the nation's moral compass. When policy becomes a reaction to fear, systems grow harsher, oversight weaker, and compassion optional. The horror here is subtle, a psychological conditioning that convinces society to accept cruelty as necessary. For decades, Britain prided itself on fairness and tolerance, yet the rising tide of hostile rhetoric risks erasing that legacy. Words may seem harmless, but repeated often enough, they rewrite reality. In today's Britain, borders no longer just guard territory, they patrol minds, drawing invisible lines between us and them. Number 8. The Channel Crossings. Journeys that end before they begin. Each dawn, small boats drift across the English Channel, carrying men, women, and children chasing a chance at safety. What looks like calm water hides deadly currents, freezing temperatures, and an uncertain welcome. In 2025 alone, over 25,000 migrants attempted this journey. Some rescued mid-sea, others never found again. The Channel has become a graveyard without crosses, where inflatable rafts deflate faster than hope. Families spend their life savings for a seat on a fragile dinghy, guided by smugglers who vanish before sunrise. The trip, meant to last hours, often ends in tragedy before land is even visible. One story that broke hearts was that of Yasmin, a mother from Syria who boarded a boat with her 2 children after waiting months in Calais. The vessel capsized halfway, leaving only a handful of survivors. Her husband in Manchester learned of her death through a call from the French Coast Guard. Similar accounts emerged throughout the year. Unrecorded names, lost identities, dreams swallowed by the sea. Despite international outrage, tougher UK border patrols and French crackdowns only pushed crossings further underground, making them more perilous. The sea's chill has replaced war's heat as a new battlefield of survival. For many, the Channel's not a route, it's a final gamble. They flee persecution, famine, and war, only to face suspicion upon arrival. Some are detained immediately, others disappear into informal labour markets. Officials call it border management, but to those watching the waves, it feels like selective mercy. The horror of the Channel crossings lies not just in the deaths, but in the silence that follows. Where news fades, names vanish, and water closes over the evidence of desperation that policy failed to solve. Number 9. The rise of anti-immigration protests, fear on the streets. In early 2025, Britain witnessed its largest wave of anti-immigration protests in more than a decade. Dozens of towns saw marches sparked by anger over hotels housing asylum seekers. What began as small community complaints quickly escalated into nationwide unrest. Protesters surrounded buses carrying refugees, windows were smashed, and police were forced to form human shields to prevent attacks. Social media amplified misinformation, claims that migrants were receiving free luxury housing or benefits, while far-right groups exploited local frustration to inflame hate. In months, more than 300 arrests were recorded as tension spread from seaside towns to city centres. Inside those hotels, families huddled in fear. Parents blocked doors with furniture while crowds outside chanted for them to go home. Volunteers who brought food or clothes faced verbal abuse, accused of helping invaders. A single false rumour could empty an entire neighbourhood into the streets. The British public, once known for its restraint, seemed caught in a storm of frustration and fear. The government's slow communication made things worse, leaving space for conspiracy to thrive. For migrants, the protest turned temporary shelters into targets, not sanctuaries. Children looked out of windows and saw not welcome signs, but torches and flags. Sociologists warn these protests reveal deep fractures within society, economic anxiety, political polarisation, and the human need to assign blame. The horror lies not only in violence, but in the normalisation of hostility. When fear is repeated often enough, it becomes identity. Each chant outside a migrant hotel echoes far beyond that street. It shapes how a nation defines compassion, belonging, and humanity itself. What Britain faced in 2025 was not just unrest. It was a reflection of how quickly empathy can vanish when division becomes the loudest voice in the crowd. Number 10. The hostile environment. When policy turns against people. The phrase hostile environment entered Britain's vocabulary in 2012, meant to deter illegal immigration. By 2025, it had become a symbol of institutional cruelty. Every aspect of daily life, renting a flat, getting medical care, finding work, was tied to immigration status. Landlords, employers, even doctors were urged to check documents, turning ordinary citizens into gatekeepers of border control. For thousands, a missing file or expired card meant sudden homelessness or denial of treatment. Bureaucracy became weaponized, and fear seeped quietly into everyday moments that should have felt safe. One Jamaican-born man, Anthony Bryan, lived in the UK for 50 years before being arrested and told he was here illegally. He spent weeks in detention despite paying taxes and raising a family in London. His story, later dramatised on television, exposed how systemic indifference could dismantle lives built over decades. Even after public apologies, the machinery kept turning. The Home Office admitted to wrongful detentions and lost applications, yet reforms moved slowly. As of 2025, thousands still await compensation or status clarification, caught in the gears of a system designed to protect borders but blind to human cost. The horror of the hostile environment is its banality, the quiet efficiency of exclusion disguised as procedure. No gunfire, no violence, just letters stamped with rejection and doors that never open again. It's a reminder that cruelty doesn't always arrive shouting. Sometimes it comes in envelopes, through forms, through silence. For those trapped within it, every phone call to an official, every appeal deadline missed, feels like erasure. Britain's promise of fairness withers when legality overshadows humanity. The hostile environment didn't just control immigration, it redefined compassion as a privilege to be earned, not a right to be given. These 10 stories reveal more than failed policies. They expose the quiet erosion of empathy beneath paperwork, speeches, and headlines. Behind every statistic lies a person once full of hope. A worker detained for a typo, a mother lost at sea, a child waiting for home in a hotel room. The United Kingdom's immigration system, once built on ideals of fairness and justice, now stands at a moral crossroads. It shows how fear, politics, and bureaucracy can turn protection into punishment. Yet it also reminds us that awareness is the first step toward accountability. Every story told keeps a life from being forgotten. Borders may define nations, but humanity defines civilization. The question is not whether a country can control who enters. It's whether it can protect its soul while doing so. Because when laws forget compassion, nations lose something far greater than control. They lose themselves. If these stories moved you, share this video so others can see the human side of immigration. Subscribe for more documentaries that uncover truth behind policies and politics. Leave your thoughts below. Because every comment, every voice, and every act of awareness brings light to those still trapped in the shadows of the system.